Okay, so this is going to be an overview of the last few chapters of Chapter 9, things that we didn't get to before winter break. But I think that they're relatively self-explanatory and not too far away from your own background knowledge before taking this course. So that's why we can sort of finish up this chapter without actually doing it in class. But of course, as usual, if you have any questions about anything that I cover here, just feel free to send me an email and we can definitely talk about it. So the first thing that we need to be familiar with is how campaigns actually impact the election itself. And interestingly, there have been many political scientists in recent decades, especially closer to the present, that say that campaigns actually may be less influential than previously thought. I mean, ultimately, what we see with campaigns is that people's beliefs tend to actually be relatively established before a campaign itself. So the idea, at least in idealistically for candidates, is to try to convert voters, right? Voter who might ordinarily vote for Republican candidate, the Democratic Party is going to, or the Democratic candidate is going to try to campaign to effectively convert them to their own party by explaining that they actually have policies that identify more directly to that voter. Um, Another thing that you will see actually may have some impact on campaigns is that they could activate voters. So, even if you have an opinion and you just don't feel like you want to vote either because you feel like your vote doesn't count, or of course if you are politically apathetic, the idea behind political campaigning in this instance is to try to get people who might be apathetic or might just say, well, my vote doesn't make a difference, to actually get out and vote. Um, but, another thing that campaigns could do, but may make campaigns a little bit less necessary, is that it could reinforce people's beliefs, right? If you already are a solid Democrat, that potentially campaigns, advertising could make you that much more within the Democratic camp. But at the same time, that might be one of the least significant elements of how campaigns impact elections. And obviously, this cartoon is kind of a way of showing that a lot of people just get completely zoned out after following a campaign. That really, watching ads, debates, everything that goes into a campaign, they may come out of it completely unaffected and maybe even less enthusiastic at the end, despite the goals of campaigners. Another thing that we need to consider is the idea of selective exposure, which we've already talked about in the chapter on the media. So this could be definitely a reason why campaigns are less influential. All right, what if voters have already made up their minds? If they see ads or if they watch political television, no matter which opinion they have, you're going to see that they're going to probably focus on the media outlet that identifies most closely with their beliefs. So if you're conservative, you're more likely to watch Fox. If you're liberal, you're more likely to watch MSNBC. And CNN attempts to be neutral. Some people say that the media inherently is biased towards the liberals. So some people say that CNN is also slanted more in the liberal direction. But regardless, we are familiar with selective exposure from a previous chapter, right? We basically know that, one thing that might influence voters more than the actual candidates themselves could be party affiliation, which we'll talk about in a little while. Also, just so you guys know, which you probably do because of the influence of PACs, incumbents tend to have an advantage in the campaigns, partly just because they're better known, right? And also, if the candidate it has a relatively good approval rating, or if things in the United States are going relatively well, if the economy is strong, um, you will see that incumbents tend to get more support just because a lot of times people are issue of the times voters. However, incumbents may not have an advantage if they have a low approval rating or if the economy is dipping. So you're going to see a lot of times um, the media is actually more effective if it convinces a voter that a candidate actually disagrees fundamentally about a certain issue that the voter values. However, like we're going to discuss in a little while, a lot of times campaigners actually are deliberately vague when stating their policies so that they can try to attract as many voters as possible, particularly independents. All right, so whether to vote or who votes, right? I mean, we are probably familiar with the limitations or the guidelines for who votes and who doesn't, but just as a basic overview, all right, obviously you have to be 18 years or older. There was a time previously in our history where the voting age was 21. Even prior to that, it was 25, and prior to that, it was 25 with property qualifications. But eventually, it was agreed upon that if you were old enough to serve in the military, you should be old enough to vote, hence the reduction to 18. Um, we also know that you have to be a citizen in order to vote. All right. And you're going to see that the voting qualifications actually expanded pretty rapidly under two different amendments in our history. The first, the 15th Amendment, which said that there should be no limitation on voting based on race or previous condition of servitude, right? So ultimately it opened up voting for African Americans specifically, of course, just male. And then the 19th Amendment expands it even further to allow women to vote, right, in 1920. You are going to see that there are bans in most states on allowing convicted criminals and immigrants to vote, right? So that, hence the citizenship requirement. And some states actually forbid convicted criminals from voting for life. So even when they are released from prison, they still can't vote. Other states, however, are just going to restrict voting for incarcerated criminals, and once they are released, they are able to be franchised again, enfranchised, that is. Um, okay, so interestingly or ironically, we're going to see that the turnout rate actually has decreased since suffrage has expanded. All right, so why is that? Why are certain people not voting even though there is more and more suffrage? Well, a couple reasons, all right? There's the obvious voter apathy, the idea that one vote will not make a difference. This definitely comes into play in solidly blue or solidly red states. Um, Also, you're going to see even the time that it takes to vote might be a deterrent. All right, think about people who work in a job where it might be difficult to get out in the middle of a Tuesday, right? Especially people who work in more blue collar jobs. They're not just going to be able to leave in order to vote, right? Now, of course, one of the things that the government has tried to do to keep that from being a huge problem is to open the polling places or open the voting areas earlier in the morning and keeping them open relatively late at night. So you could argue that might be more of an excuse than an actual deterrent from voting. Other people have proposed that we should make election day either a holiday or move it to a Saturday so that more people can vote. Okay, also you're going to see if the political parties are so vague that there really isn't a key distinction between them, this also may discourage people from voting because they basically say, well, what's the difference between these two candidates? Is it really going to affect my day-to-day life? Okay, all right, reasons for voting. All right, one of the theories supporting voting and a significant turnout rate is the idea of political efficacy. So basically going directly against one of the ideas that we talked about on the previous slide, which is that one vote won't make a difference. Political government argues that votes, no matter how many, do make a difference. All right, and obviously this still means that not an individual necessarily is going to affect the vote, but think about how many individuals might feel that way. And if we can convince them that voting does make a difference, ultimately we're going to increase the turnout rate enough that it actually could affect the election. Especially apathetic voters who might kind of be in the middle of the political spectrum, if they can actually zero in on certain issues that may make them support or oppose a candidate, it could certainly sway the election results. Okay, also other people argue that you should vote because it's your civic duty, right? Just like you have to pay taxes, right? Just like you have to serve jury duty. Why not vote, right? So there's kind of a debate about whether or not voting is a civic right, which would mean that you can choose to do it or to abstain, or whether it's a civic duty, whether or not you are actually, whether or not there's sort of not a mandate, but that there is major pressure on citizens to actually vote. We see how many people advertise to try to get more people to vote. And realize that there are certain countries that actually require compulsory voting and try to enforce it. So, certain people argue that this is something that we actually should expand to the US. Other people argue that this is a major violation of our basic civil liberties. So if you do decide to vote, how do you register? All right, so many of you guys are going to be dealing with this pretty soon when you turn 18. All right, now why is registration required now? There was a period in our history earlier on where you didn't have to register. Why is that a problem? Well, basically, there was this saying for a while in history, vote early and often. In other words, if you weren't registered, you could vote multiple times. And that clearly could sway the election. If you're really passionate about one candidate, why not vote for them 10 times? Their vote counts for 10 times more. All right, so basically this was a way to try to clear elections from massive corruption and anything that would manipulate the results of an election. All right, so that's why we get voter registration laws. And basically what this means, if you're registered, your name is on a roll. All right, so when you show up to vote, they know who you are. It's then you're able to go in and vote. All right, so some people might suggest that voter registration is discouraging. Does this actually prevent certain people from voting? It depends. All right, there are some states, Connecticut included, that allow same-day registration. So that means if I'm not registered, I can walk into City Hall the day of an election and I can register, which isn't a huge deterrent then. But states that do not allow same-day registration, it might be much more difficult. The state I came from, Pennsylvania, did not when I lived there. So basically, I would have to plan ahead if I wanted to vote. All right, so things can be more difficult because of registration. You're going to see that with same-day registration, there are higher turnout rates. I would say that's pretty obvious. And you're going to see other states that realize that it is difficult, especially because certain city halls or town halls are only open during business hours. So if you work a typical 9-to-5 job, it might be hard for you to actually get out and register. So many states have adopted motor voter laws, which basically means that you can kill two birds with one stone. If you're going in to get your driver's license or to get it renewed, then you can also register to vote at the same time. You just check a box in your driver's license application. All right, so that makes it a lot easier. Let's look a little bit more closely into a new phenomenon, voter ID laws, which many people argue are unconstitutional, but other people argue in favor of them because they say that it prevents voter fraud. All right, but some people say that, in order to have a government issued ID, this is kind of a modern form of a poll tax. You have to pay for an ID, obviously. So let's see if I can actually click on this. I can't click on it, but let's see. I'm just going to copy and paste it into browsers. Yes, I was listening to music before. So let me get this window the same size, more or less, of my little screen here. So pardon me, it just will take a second. Alrighty. So, okay. Voter ID laws. This is a map that details which states have voter ID laws, strict ones, and which states do not require them. Right? Notice the darkest states are ones that have a strict photo ID law. The second to darkest states make you show an ID, but you don't have to have a photo on it. And then the lighter states request your ID. It doesn't have to be a photo ID. All right, and if you don't have it, so, for example, our state does request a photo ID, but if you don't have one, you can provide information like your name, date of birth, and your address, and then you can still vote. All right, and then there are all the states in gray that don't have voter ID laws. All right, so ultimately, why does that matter? Let's get ourselves back into view here. All right, so one of the reasons why people argue against voter ID laws is because you can see in this chart here, there is a larger percentage of African Americans that don't have a government issued ID. So many people argue that it is indeed unconstitutional. I just have to move this up a little bit so I can see the time that we have left. Okay, we're basically out. So next